Werewolves are one of the 5 tribes that were supported in Innistrad and in each of the returns to that plane. Unlike the other 4 tribes on that plane, werewolves have had a lot of trouble trying to see play, with very few of their cards ever putting up results, and werewolf decks have never really been successful, despite the other tribes in those sets, such as humans, spirits, and zombies, all having had some success at some point. The big difference between werewolves and these other tribes is that all the werewolves, at least on Innistrad, share a very specific mechanic. All werewolves were dual-face cards that could transform from human form into a werewolf form, and they all shared the same transformation condition. The front side would transform to the werewolf at the beginning of each upkeep if no spells were cast last turn, and the back side would transform back into a human at the beginning of each upkeep if 2 or more spells were cast last turn. Now, there are tons of transform cards that have seen tons of success, for example, Delver of Secrets or Thing in the Ice. So the transform mechanic itself isn't the issue. The problem is the condition they choose for werewolves in particular. You see, most transform cards, including werewolves, follow the design philosophy of the front side not being strong enough, but the back side being really good. For example, the front side of Delver and Thing are both pretty bad, but the back sides are extremely above rate. The same is largely true for werewolf cards. This has 3 big issues. First off, this condition is really bad for aggro decks. This condition is really easy for your opponent to interact with, and you have to flip every single werewolf individually. Let's start with why this condition is bad for aggro decks. Aggro decks usually want to flood the board as quickly as possible. This, of course, means they have to cast lots of spells. Of course, if you're casting lots of spells, that means you're never flipping your werewolves over. The only real way to flip this card over in an aggro deck is to play them extremely early and just hope your opponent doesn't have anything to cast for 1 or 2 mana, which can happen in some hands. Or wait until the late game when your opponent is top decking and hope they top deck a land, but aggro decks usually want the game to end before then. The fact that your opponent might miscast an early spell made cheap werewolves like Village Messenger and Reckless Waif a lot more likely to transform than other werewolves, which made them much better, but they only saw some play. So, this condition made the cards a lot harder to actually swarm the board with, but it also gave your opponent way too much control over what side your cards were on. You see, since you needed a turn where no spells were cast for your cards to flip, your opponent could simply cast a spell on their own turn to stop your board from getting a lot scarier. This means if you wanted your cards to flip, you often had to do it yourself. However, this sets you up for some huge blowouts. What your opponent could do is simply wait for you to go to your end step, and if you cast no spells to try and flip your werewolves, they could cast one tiny 1-mana spell to stop all your werewolves from flipping. This was backbreaking, as you basically would have to skip your entire turn and got nothing out of it. And finally, you had to flip every single one of your werewolves individually. Each werewolf checks itself during each upkeep. So if you transform one werewolf and then played another, you'd only have one of them transformed, and you'd either have to wait another turn to not cast any spells in order to flip it, or wait for your opponent to not cast any spells on their turn to flip your next werewolf. This made the mechanic really awkward to play with, as it's a quest that you'd constantly have to be working towards, and constantly trying to figure out if it's better to develop your board or try to flip your cards. Together, this means that the only way to get the good half of your werewolf cards was either to just hope your opponent didn't cast anything, which was fairly unlikely, or to make an incredibly risky play to try and flip your cards and risk your opponent blowing you out. On top of that, you constantly have to think about all of this and have to keep making this difficult decision every single turn. Now, Wizards knew about a lot of these issues, so they did give werewolf decks a few cards to try and get around all of this. One thing they did was give the deck flash spells, like Alpaca Resurgence. Flash means you can cast your spells at instant speed. With this, you could still develop your board while skipping your turn to flip all your werewolves. They also gave them some cards like Gyre Reach Bandit, which when transformed, has the ability to transform any other werewolf you play when it enters the battlefield. This solves the every card flip separately issue, because once you flip Bandit, you've basically flipped all your werewolves. However, there are still a few issues here. You see, you can still only cast one spell each turn, or your stuff will get flipped back to its weak side. This hampers the speed at which you can develop your board. Not to mention, you can only play this way whenever you actually have your Bandit flipped, making it so that a single removal spell can disrupt your strategy. On the other hand, the flash spells like Resurgence were just a little bit too expensive and weak to make up for their instant speed, as that's on its own powerful ability. Other tribal decks that came out of the same set could put out just as much damage for far less work, while giving your opponents less ways to stop their game plan. Now, while werewolves as a whole were pretty weak, there were a few standout cards in the bunch that managed to see play. Mayor of Averbruck is a kind of a weird card, because it's actually a human support card and a werewolf support card at the same time. On the front side, it's a 2-mana 1/1 that gives all your other humans +1/+1, making it an okay way for human decks to try to pump all their creatures. However, once it transforms into Halpak Alpha, it gains the ability to give all your other werewolf and werewolf creatures +1/+1, and gains the ability where at the beginning of your end step, you create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. This made the card a lot better, as the front side was good in human decks, but if your opponent ever let it flip, it would start to run away with the game by slowly making you a board full of 3/3s. This led to the card seeing play in a few different formats in human tribal decks. Speaking of werewolves with a really good front half, we have Duskwatch Recruiter. This is a 2-mana 2/2 with the ability where you can pay 2 and 1 green to look at the top 3 cards of your library, reveal a creature card from among them, and put that card into your hand. Then you put the other cards on the bottom of your deck. However, if a player casts no spells, it becomes Crawlin' Horde Howler, a 3/3 with the ability where creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. The reason that Duskwatch has escaped the werewolf curse is that the front side was actually a lot better than the back side. You see, there were a lot of decks that liked its ability to draw creatures. Certain combo decks can actually make infinite mana, specifically by using Vizier of Remedies and Devoted Druid. Basically, what you would do is tap the Druid for mana, then use its ability to put a -1/-1 counter on itself to untap it. Since Vizier of Remedies will reduce the number of -1/-1 counters placed onto it, you'll actually put 0 -1/-1 counters on it instead. This will let you use the ability as many times as you want. Then you'll cast a Walking Ballista, which costs XX, meaning any amount of mana twice. Enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and you can remove a +1/+1 counter on it to deal 1 damage to any target. Since you have infinite mana, you can just kill your opponent. Now, since all 3 parts of this combo are creatures, Duskwatch can find all of them for you. And once you have the mana to get the combo up, Duskwatch can find Ballista to let you win the game. Since Duskwatch's front half is so strong, the fact that you don't have access to the back half doesn't matter. The last really good werewolf card is Huntmaster of Fells. This is a 2/2 for 2, 1 red, and 1 green that makes you a 2/2 green wolf token and gains you 2 life whenever it enters the battlefield or transforms into Huntmaster. Ravager of the Fells has the ability where, whenever it transforms into the Ravager, you deal 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker and 2 damage to target creature that the player or that planeswalker's owner controls. Huntmaster is one of the most well-known werewolf cards, and solves the problem with werewolves in a really neat way. Unlike other werewolves, whenever the card transforms into either side, you get value. Generally, you only want your werewolves on the backside, as that's the strong one. However, Huntmaster will give you something whenever it transforms at all, making it a lot easier to get value off of. If more werewolves were like this, where transforming at all was beneficial, rather than wanting the card to stay on the backside, the mechanic would be a lot better overall. Now, we've gone over the original iteration of this mechanic, but Wizards recently rebooted the entire mechanic. They introduced the Daybound/Nightbound mechanic, which was staple to all the werewolves. How this works is that whenever a Daybound card enters the battlefield, it starts the day-night cycle. While it's day, all Daybound cards are on their front face, and while it's night, they all transform to the backside. How this cycle works is at the beginning of each upkeep, if the players whose turn it was last turn didn't cast any spells and it was day, it becomes night. And if it was night and the turn player casts 2 or more spells, it becomes day again. This new mechanic solves 2 big issues with the old mechanic. First off, it only cares about the turn player casting spells. This means your opponent can't opt on your end step to stop you from flipping your cards. So if you want to skip casting spells on your turn to transform your werewolves, your opponent can't stop you, which makes these cards much, much better. Additionally, now the thing that determines what face your werewolves are on isn't tied to a single card, but rather just part of the game state overall. Once you start the day/night cycle, the game tracks it regardless of if there's any Daybound cards on the field. This means that even if you lose all your werewolves, if it's night and you cast another one, it will still be night and they will transform. This means that the deck basically gets to play as if they had transformed Bandit and play the entire game. This solves 2 of the 3 major issues with the werewolf deck. But the final issue still remains. The fact is, skipping your turn to flip your werewolves is still a huge downside, and it's a big enough downside that dedicated werewolves decks still aren't successful. However, this recent version of werewolves has led to a few more individual werewolf cards being successful, and the changes made to the mechanic certainly did help them out. Brutal Cather is a 2/2 for 2 and 1 white with the ability where, when it enters the battlefield or transforms into the Cather, you exile target creatures in opponent control until it leaves the battlefield. On the night side, it's Moonrage Brute, a 3/3 with first strike, meaning it deals combat damage before other creatures, and Ward, pay 3 life, meaning that whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you counter it unless they pay 3 life. This card follows the same philosophy as Huntmaster, where it transforming at all is usually good for you. On the front side, it gets to exile a card, but on the back side, it's a better creature that requires your opponent to hurt themselves to kill it and get their cards back. Now, you never want this card to enter on its back half, which is why this card has only ever seen play in decks where it's the only werewolf. Another big standout is Graveyard Trespasser. This is a 3/3 for 2 and 1 black, with Ward, discard a card, and the effect where, whenever it attacks, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, then if it was a creature card, you gain 1 life and your opponent loses 1 life. On the backside, it's Graveyard Glen, a 4/4 with War, discard a card, and the ability where when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile 2 cards from your graveyard and then drain 1 life for each creature you exiled. Trespasser is a card that's good on both sides, and the backside is just a slightly better version of the front side. Without the backside, some decks would maybe still run the card, so having difficulty getting access to it isn't enough to stop it from being good. Now, while the day/night mechanic did solve some of the deck's problems, it did make a few new ones, at least from a design perspective. You see, these new werewolves don't really play nice with the old ones, because the old ones still work the way they used to and don't care at all if it's day or night. You can see how hard this is designed for by looking at Tovalor, Dire Overlord. This card has the ability on the front side where, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 3 or more wolves and/or werewolves, it simply becomes night, and then you also transform any number of human werewolf creatures you control. This card is designed to basically stitch the old and new werewolves together, forcing both of them to be on the same side, as well as giving you an easier condition to make it night. Even with this card, werewolves haven't really taken off anywhere. Though that might not have anything to do with Tovalor not being good enough, and more to do with the deck not having enough good werewolves to play. However, Tovalor has led to the deck being more successful than ever before, at least in Standard. Now, there really isn't any other mechanic like werewolves. Most transform cards only transform into the back half, rather than going back and forth. However, there was a deck that did something at least a little bit similar. There was a theme in Standard of paying you off for not casting spells during your own turn. There was a deck built around Nightpack Ambusher, which was supposed to be a werewolf support card, but instead saw play in green-blue decks that wanted to play at instant speed. Nightpack Ambusher is a 4/4 wolf with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green, it has flash, and has the abilities where other wolf and werewolf creatures you control get +1/+1, and at the beginning of your end step, if you didn't cast any spells on your turn, you make a 2/2 green wolf creature token. This deck was a lot better than werewolf decks ever were, and the main reason is that skipping their turn to get the wolf token didn't actually mean they were skipping their turn at all, and you could easily lose all your value by your opponent casting 2 spells on their own turn. You see, this deck was built to play on their opponent's turn, playing almost no cards that weren't able to be cast at instant speed. Werewolf decks couldn't do this, because even if they had a few cards with flash, the majority of their cards still had to be played on their own turn. Additionally, the tokens it made for you didn't just die if your opponent cast 2 spells. In werewolf decks, as soon as your opponent manages to cast 2 spells, you're losing all that advantage you got from flipping your cards. This means that the payoff you got for playing on your opponent's turn was way higher. So, we can sort of see why werewolves failed. They had a bunch of restrictions that force you to try and play on your opponent's turn, which is something that they weren't able to do very well, because too many other creatures were just normal spells without flash. On top of that, it's a mechanic with a built-in way for your opponent to get around it, because they have as much control over your cards as you do. However, there are a few solutions and a few interesting things about the mechanic. If the cards are designed such that, rather than having a good and bad, like most transform cards, both sides just allowed you to get some form of value, and you just wanted to transform them as much as possible, the mechanic could be made a lot better. Additionally, if the tribe had actually just had flash stapled onto all of their cards, it would be a lot easier to play on your opponent's turn, like other successful decks with a similar theme have done. However, most interesting of all is the fact that werewolf cards seem to work best in other random decks rather than all together. You see, in things like value-based mid-range decks, you can often hold up mana for interaction or try to grind the game to a standstill, both of which increases the chances of your werewolves flipping. If your opponent is low on cards, they're more likely to not cast a spell on their turn. If you have interaction to play, not casting a spell on your turn becomes a better play far more often. On the other hand, the best werewolves and aggro decks have been 1 werewolves, where you would play them on turn 1 and hope your opponent happened to not have a 1 mana spell to play. Then you would just only cast 1 spell a turn to get more damage out. Werewolves were often okay, but the mechanic they chose made the deck on a whole very bad. If they didn't transform back into their small human side, or were designed so that transforming in general was always good, the deck might have been more successful. But as for right now, they're a deck that wants to flood the board, but need you to not cast spells to get the full value off of your cards. The cards are pulling you in 2 different directions, and that results in a very bad deck, with just a few cards with the mechanic managing to see play. Alright, and that's the video. If you have any other ideas for videos about failed mechanics, or cards you want to see me talk about in the future, go ahead and leave those down in a comment below.